Think the 1920s were just about jazz and flappers? Well, think again. This era also encompassed the groundbreaking cultural movement known as the Harlem Renaissance, led by numerous Black artists, writers, musicians, and thinkers. And contrary to mainstream narratives, historical evidence suggests that many of the influential figures of this time were LGBTQ. Join us in this episode as we explore the queer icons and places that shaped this vibrant era. This episode and others like it are brought to you by the generous support of my patrons over on Patreon. If you'd like early access to every video, ad-free content, and access to our Discord server, consider joining our community. Hello and welcome to Closeted History, the podcast where we out the queer and trans history that you never knew. My name is Destiny. I use she, they pronouns. Super excited to get into it with you today. I'm feeling a little bit nervous because I'm solo this time. If you haven't caught the last couple of episodes, the last episode was with my good friend TK over at For the Love of History. We talked about some ancient queer lovers. And then the opener for the season was with my friend Thomas, who was also on last season. And they and I talked about Frida, the 2002 biopic. So if you haven't checked out those episodes yet, be sure to do so after this one. And so without a further ado, let's get into it. So as I mentioned in the intro, today's episode is all about the Harlem Renaissance. And now most of you, maybe not most of you, but some of you might know that I am an educator in my other life. And I have taught the Harlem Renaissance for many, many, many years. And I didn't know any of this stuff. So hopefully this episode provides some more information that you also didn't know. And as always, I'll leave like the links down below so that you can explore on your own as well. So I just want to introduce Harlem's roots, how Harlem became Harlem, and provide some context. So Harlem came to be the vibrant cultural hub it was through a number of interconnected factors, with the Great Migration serving as a pivotal catalyst. And during this period, thousands of Americans fled the South for cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Harlem itself, seeking economic opportunities and refuge from the racial violence and systemic oppression of the Jim Crow laws in the South. And not to say that they didn't experience racism in the North, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. Interestingly, the Great Migration was not just limited to Black Americans. White Americans also moved in large numbers during this time, also seeking economic opportunities.
The Great Migration was not just Black people.
Oh,
The Great Migration
really?
was also white people. And white people migrated from the South in greater numbers. The story of the Great Migration, one story that we have latched onto, I would dispute some of this, but I'm okay with people arguing with me of this, is that it was because they were escaping racism. The largest motivation was economic opportunity, right? The idea that, and the boll weevil, right? Because it takes a lot for people to want to leave their families, right? We know that. So people were moving, and when they got to these northern cities, they faced incredible racism. I mean, when we tell the story about when Martin Luther King Jr. went to Chicago and he said, "Oh, they could teach white folks in Mississippi a thing or two," right? Because of the violence,
Yes,
that people who migrated.
As Dr. Imani Perry highlights, this movement of white Americans played a significant role in shaping the economic and social landscapes of these northern cities. So it's important to recognize that the influx of white Americans influenced the racial dynamics in these urban areas. Their arrival often exacerbated already existing racial tensions and contributed to the racism that was experienced by Black Americans in the North. And so when they migrated, it also resulted in competition for jobs, for housing, which sometimes led to increased racial segregation and conflict. And this is all happening like against the backdrop of the Prohibition era, which was from 1920 to 1933, when speakeasies emerged as secret spaces where people could drink alcohol despite it being illegal. And these venues were more than just places for booze. They became vital sanctuaries for Black performers and LGBTQ plus individuals who often faced exclusion elsewhere. Here, they could freely express themselves and engage in relationships that were otherwise forbidden, such as same sex or interracial relationships. And this underground scene played a pivotal role in fostering a vibrant nightlife where many of Harlem Renaissance's most renowned figures launched their careers. So, next, I want to talk about the underground spaces and some of the challenges that they faced. Artists such as Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Josephine Baker found their voices and gained widespread recognition through performances in these underground spaces. And it was here that the boundaries of race, sexuality, and social status of the time were often blurred. There were countless nightclubs like the Cotton Club, Harry Hansberry's Clam House, where Gladys Bentley performed often, or Club Hacha, where fellow queer performer Jimmy Daniels was often found. On the nightclub map of Harlem, it boasts that the city has 500 plus speakeasies and clubs that were opening, closing, and serving breakfast all at the same time. Additionally, within these underground spaces, drag ball culture flourished, epitomized by events like the Hamilton Lodge Ball. The Hamilton Lodge Ball, aka the Fairies Ball, became the most popular yearly event for the LGBTQ plus community. It is the earliest known documentation of ballroom scene. Newspaper clippings from the era and prior reported that the ball had been an affair for decades, with a majority of Black audiences and participants. In 1937, the ball recorded over 8,000 guests. Ballroom scene and culture was not exclusive to New York, but the Hamilton Ball was one of the most well known because of its size and its popularity. Bowery Boogie writes that Harlem Renaissance social activist and writer Langston Hughes proclaimed the drag balls to be the strangest and gaudiest of all Harlem spectacles in the 1920s. And he concluded that Harlem was in vogue.
This is Voguing.
It's like this birth of fashion and birth of new dance.
Inspired by the style of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and the famous images of models in Vogue magazine, voguing is characterized by striking a series of poses as if one is modeling for a photo shoot. Arm and leg movements are angular, linear, rigid, and move swiftly from one static position to another.
Just like a model is trying to think of a different pose for the photographer, you're trying to think of a new pose or new movement to go with the beat.
This style of dance arose from spaces like the Hamilton Lodge Ball and many other ballrooms across the US. So that's right, Madonna did not invent voguing. While Madonna famously showcased voguing in her work, its origins and its development stem from Harlem's underground scene, where it evolved and continues to be used as a form of self expression and performance art among the LGBTQ plus community. I do want to note that despite finding success in Harlem's clubs and underground scene, many Black entertainers were still barred from much of city life due to segregation. So while white patrons frequented Harlem's nightlife to indulge, they also conveniently overlooked the systemic inequalities that kept the Black entertainers that they were admiring from other parts of the city. And this dichotomy highlights how white individuals maintained racial segregation even as they enjoyed Harlem's very vibrant culture. Next, I want to focus on some key figures that were said to be queer during this time. Amidst the bustling underground scene of Harlem, Black queer artists and intellectuals played a huge role in the Harlem Renaissance. Like other queer people in early 20th century America, they often had to hide their sexualities and gender identities. Many leading figures of the period, including Langston Hughes, Josephine Baker, Billie Holiday, Gladys Bentley, and many, many more, all have historical evidence of being LGBTQ. The music scene of the Harlem Renaissance had numerous queer icons, one being Gladys Bentley. Born in Philadelphia in 1907, she ran away and found refuge in Harlem when she was just 16. She started working at Harry Hansberry's Clam House on 133rd Street, one of the city's most notorious gay speakeasies. She performed in men's evening attire and flirted with women openly in the audience. And while many thought that her overt gestures were just for publicity, it was actually a radical affirmation of who she was. Her public persona definitely changed over the course of her career as the rise of McCarthyism impacted the ability to actually be openly LGBTQ+, which we'll touch on more in a bit. Another icon who used music as a way to live in their authentic selves is Ma Rainey. Her song Prove It On Me Blues became an anthem and leaves very little room for interpretation on her sexuality. She sings, "Went out last night with a crowd of my friends. They must have been women, 'cause I don't like no men." Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Alberta Hunter were all pioneers of an early Black feminist art that focused on working class issues and confronted the challenge of living up to the idealized image of a progressive Black woman of the era who was supposed to keep her lesbian passions closeted. These three women were absolutely not doing that. In literature, County Cullen and Alain Locke emerged as prominent voices. Alain Locke, celebrated for his anthology, which encompassed fiction, poetry, and essays, was privately known to identify as gay, although the extent to which he publicly acknowledged this remains debated. His circles included other speculated gay men like County Cullen, who was described as very secretive about his life. However, it was later confirmed by his first wife that the reason for their divorce was because Cullen admitted that he was sexually attracted to men. And Cullen's poetry is often taught in the context of queer culture today. One of my personal favorites from this time period is Langston Hughes. I've taught his works many, many times and never knew that he was part of the LGBTQ plus community until now. Despite his relative silence on the subject, speculation on his sexuality has always existed. Some theorists claim that Hughes wasn't gay, but was rather uninterested in sex with anyone, regardless of gender. Others claim that he was a gay man, and any suggestion to the contrary is an attempt to hide an important part of his identity. The project Making Queer History explores this in an article when they discuss his sexuality. It is entirely possible that Langston Hughes was asexual and gay. The first biographer who suggested his asexuality, Arnold Rampersad, did so because there was no concrete evidence supporting Langston Hughes's supposed homosexuality. And they make a really great point about queer history in general, and that's why when we look at these figures that there has to be nuance in our recollection of history when they say, that being said, this idea of concrete evidence on its own is problematic in the study of queer history. Not only is evidence often hidden to protect queer people, but much of queerness does not leave behind the kind of trace that can be easily measured and deemed to be clear proof. Queerness is not an action, but a way of being, and one can be queer without ever acting on it. The ideology which requires action for queerness to be validated has been largely left behind by queer scholars. In Langston Hughes's case, he engages with queerness and the queer community in many ways that are definitively queer, even if he himself seemingly never openly identified himself as such. So, this brings us to the end of the era. The Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash in October 1929 and persisted through the 1930s, profoundly impacted the vibrant queer expressions of the Harlem Renaissance. This economic crisis forced individuals and communities to prioritize their basic survival over any kind of artistic pursuits. Queer communities, which were previously flourishing in Harlem's cultural landscape during the 1920s, faced heightened economic hardships and social challenges, significantly reducing their visibility and influence. Amidst global economic turmoil, the rise of fascism in Europe, and the escalating tensions leading up to World War II in the late 1930s definitely intensified societal conservatism. In the United States, this period saw a growing emphasis on conformity and traditional values, with lasting implications for subsequent decades. Reflecting on this period underscores the critical role of intersectionality, shaping the narrative of queer history during the Harlem Renaissance. And despite these challenges, Harlem in the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s served as an important cultural hub for queer individuals. It provided a space for artistic expression and community building that contributed to the broader goals of social change. If you enjoyed this episode of diving into the queer history of the Harlem Renaissance, be sure to check out our episode on the history of disco. Both eras provided essential spaces for LGBTQ plus communities to express themselves through music. And if you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much. Leave me a little sunflower emoji if you're watching on YouTube. But if you enjoyed this episode, please give a like, a comment, share this episode with someone that you think would enjoy it. All that stuff really helps out. Thank you again so much for watching, and until the next time, friend.